Initiating the English opening immediately challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming for flexible piece play and potential queenside expansion. Embracing the king's Indian setup, black signals a commitment to a fianchetto and potential kingside dynamism. Aggressively seizing the center, this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's fianchettoed bishop and opens diagonals for white's pieces. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop solidifies control of the long diagonal and prepares for queenside castling. Dominating the center, this pawn push seizes vital space, aiming to open lines for piece development and control crucial squares. Solidifying the center and preparing the kingside fianchetto pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling, NC3 aims for harmonious piece development. Securing the queenside flank, A6 prepares to expand or support future pawn advances, potentially eyeing the B5 square to challenge white's central control. Fortifying the central pawns and preparing to activate the kingside bishop creates a solid foundation for queenside expansion. Developing this knight efficiently contests the central influence and prepares for kingside castling, harmonizing with the fianchettoed bishop. Solidifying the E4 pawn's defense, white aims for a controlled pawn center, potentially preparing for a kingside pawn storm later. Solidifying the pawn chain, this prepares a potential queenside expansion or a thematic pawn break. Developing the bishop to D3 strengthens the kingside and prepares for queenside castling, aiming for a solid central pawn structure. Embracing the queenside expansion, black challenges white's central grip and seeks to activate the b-pawn for future queenside play. Securing the queen's connection to the kingside and preparing kingside expansion while eyeing the c-file's potential. Opening the b-file, black disrupts white's pawn chain and prepares to contest central space. Reclaiming the pawn stabilizes the center, opening diagonals for the queen and bishop to exert pressure. Unleashing central pawns forcefully challenges white's pawn structure, opening critical lines. Relocating the bishop to b3 sharpens the diagonal for queen and knight interplay, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive setup. Disrupting white's central pawn chain, this capture immediately opens lines, forcing a decision on how to recapture and potentially creating new targets. Recapturing the pawn opens the knight's diagonal, putting pressure on black's kingside. Casting secures the monarch, a vital preliminary before delving into the central skirmish. Developing the knight to a more active square clears the way for the f-pawn's advance. Seizing queenside space, this pawn thrust threatens to unravel white's pawn chain and create an outpost. Securing the king's safety amid the unfolding queenside pawns is paramount, clearing the way for further development. Unleashing the queenside pawn storm sacrifices queenside space for initiative, potentially opening lines against white's king. Securing the bishop's diagonal strengthens kingside defense while eyeing potential pawn breaks. Anchoring the knight here prepares for a central pawn push or a queenside expansion, solidifying black's structure. Asserting control over the open c-file now, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure. Securing the b-file with the rook allows black to challenge white's queenside pawn structure. Sacrificing the knight opens lines, potentially pressuring black's king and forcing a pawn structure adjustment. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop solidifies black's central presence and creates dynamic imbalances in the pawn structure. Reclaiming the e4 square reinforces central presence and prepares for a queenside pawn push. Initiating a pawn lever with the knight's relocation, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially open a diagonal. Opening the e-file strategically, white prepares to contest crucial central squares and potentially exploit pawn weaknesses. Unleashing the bishop from its pawns, shadow aims for central influence and potential queenside breakthroughs. Anchoring the rook on the d-file opens lines and pressurizes black's pawn chain, aiming to disrupt their queenside structure. Reclaiming a square for the bishop, this repositions it to a more active diagonal, potentially targeting white's kingside potential. Disrupting the bishop pair offers a clear central pawn majority at the cost of some queenside space. Sacrificing the bishop opens vital diagonal lines, potentially creating attacking chances against white's castled king. Striking the exposed dark squares around black's king, this queen sacrifice initiates a decisive tactical sequence. Solidifying the king's shield, f6 anticipates potential breakthroughs on the kingside by white's pieces. Reclaiming the d-file allows for potential pressure along it and prepares for centralized piece play. The bishop retreats, abandoning the diagonal that had been a point of contention, now looking to support the kingside's potential skirmishes. An aggressive pawn thrust aimed at creating kingside attacking chances, potentially sacrificing safety for initiative. Shifting the queen to the queenside offers protection and eyes potential targets on that flank. Securing the queen's bishop and preventing queenside infiltration by solidifying the pawn structure. A bold bid for central influence, aiming to dislodge the beleaguered king and exploit open lines. Shifting the knight to create attacking chances on the kingside opens up the center. Seeking to disrupt white's queenside grip and reactivate the queen, this maneuver subtly realigns black's forces towards the kingside. This repositioning seeks to improve bishop activity and coordinate on the kingside, aiming to exploit the open files. Reclaiming central influence, black repositions the bishop to pressure white's d-pawn and challenge control of the e4 square. Reclaiming central influence, this knight maneuver aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure. Seeking to untangle its queenside, black repositions the queen for potential maneuvering. Trading queens simplifies, potentially leading to an endgame where black's bishop pair might become less influential. The king's newfound freedom on f8 offers a central outpost, but the queens are gone, signaling a positional pawn race. Seizing control of the c-file, the knight menacingly targets black's queenside pawns. Reclaiming the open c-file with the rook is a sensible defensive measure, shoring up weaknesses. This repositioning of the knight aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create potential outposts on the queenside. Retrieving the bishop from its precarious outpost redirects pressure, eyeing potential weaknesses on the queenside. Seizing the open file with the rook creates immediate pressure on black's queenside structure. The doubled pawns on the c-file will become a severe long-term weakness for black, impacting their pawn structure detrimentally. Doubling pawns on the c-file severely weakens black's kingside structure, presenting an immediate target. Reclaiming the c-file offers a chance to untangle the rook, though it opens the way for white's king to become more active. Reclaiming the square to pressure the d-pawn and prepare for an assault on the queenside. Challenging the knight's outpost, black boldly endeavors to disrupt white's queenside structure with this bishop sortie. Knight repositions to a potent outpost, threatening the pinned rook and asserting dominance on the queenside. Repositioning the rook to secure better outpost squares and threaten white's vulnerable pawns. Re-establishing pressure on the d5 pawn creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces black to react defensively, potentially disrupting their coordination. Unleashing the central pawn aims to disrupt white's knight blockade and activate black's dormant pieces. Securing the passed pawn's path while repositioning the knight for potential mating threats. Reclaiming the d-file, black initiates a desperate attempt to disrupt white's centralized knight and open lines for counterplay. Securing the open file, white forces a material exchange to simplify into a favorable endgame. The pawn recapture finally resolves the central tension, initiating a clear endgame with significant material disparity. Utilizing the pawn majority to gain a decisive advantage in the endgame. Finding a safe haven for the monarch in this complicated endgame is paramount. Exploiting the king's exposed position, this pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt black's remaining coordination and secure a decisive material advantage. Repositioning the bishop to this square creates an inviting target, potentially leading to a lost tempo if white can attack it effectively. Unleashing the bishop to threaten the pinned rook creates immediate tactical pressure on black's position. Reconnecting the knight to the kingside offers a chance to organize defense and counterattack the advanced pawns. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount as the endgame unfolds, demanding careful king positioning. The knight's repositioning toward the center aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create new attacking avenues. Preparing to liberate the bishop, aiming to activate the queenside and exploit the open lines for a positional advantage. Activating the king to defend the knight offers a glimmer of hope. The knight aggressively penetrates, forcing the black king into a precarious position. King's repositioning is crucial. This retreat aims to shield the monarch from further threats and prepare for potential pawn advances. The knight repositions, eyeing central squares and preparing for a renewed attack on black's exposed king. Trading off the bishop offers black a welcome simplification, aiming to navigate the ensuing pawn-down endgame with active pieces. Unleashing the pawn chain's power, this capture solidifies control over key central squares. The king's exposed position now becomes a critical weakness, demanding immediate attention. Advancing the g-pawn now unlocks fresh attacking avenues against the exposed black king. Proposing a central pawn thrust to exploit the exposed white king's position. Pushing the pawn forward intends to liberate the knight and create a passed pawn. Opening the kingside pawn structure like this, especially with your king exposed, invites immediate danger. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain creates a passed pawn opportunity. The king abandons its shelter, venturing into a dangerous, open landscape. Safeguarding the monarch's safety becomes paramount as it navigates the central complexities.